Imagine standing on the edge of a vast, icy coastline, the wind whipping across your face, and realizing that a stretch of land no wider than a single highway could change the entire world. It seems impossible, right? Yet, 2.6 million years ago, something just like this began to appear on Earth, unnoticed by the creatures roaming the ancient landscapes. Mammuthus americanus, the massive mammoths that would one day wander the tundras of North America, paused at the sight of a narrow strip of land emerging from the waters, connecting continents that had once been isolated. The oceans on either side shimmered under the sun, reflecting a world that was both familiar and utterly alien, while glaciers crept slowly down from distant mountains, leaving trails of frost that reached toward the sea. As the first Mammuthus cautiously stepped onto the exposed land bridge, its massive feet pressing into the cold, damp soil, it set off a chain reaction that would ripple across the climate system. You could see the moment when ocean currents began to shift, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet powerful enough to alter the temperature balance across the globe. The air felt different, carrying a chill that hinted at a change far beyond what any animal could sense. Above, the sky was a pale gray, sunlight struggling through high clouds, casting a diffuse glow on a landscape poised on the edge of transformation. The narrow land connection seemed almost insignificant, dwarfed by the immensity of oceans. Yet as the Mammuthus continued its cautious trek, the water currents adjusted, redirecting warmth and cold, and the early stages of a new ice age were quietly taking shape. Around the mammoths, other creatures watched, uncertain. Herds of prehistoric deer paused, their ears flicking to the wind, sensing the subtle shift in the environment. Even small plants began to respond, their leaves less vibrant, as if warning that the world was on the verge of a major change. And in the distant highlands, glaciers that had only existed as small, isolated remnants began to creep downward, inch by inch, slowly but relentlessly, following a rhythm dictated by forces far larger than themselves. The Mammuthus, unaware of the monumental role it played, moved steadily across the bridge, its massive form a moving monument to the connection between land, water, and climate. The snow began to fall lightly, settling on the mammoth's fur, hinting at the colder world that was emerging. Streams that once ran freely now carried chunks of ice, redirecting flow across valleys and plains. And beneath the surface, sediment and soil were already recording the evidence of this dramatic shift, preserving a snapshot of Earth in the midst of an extraordinary transformation. The world seemed to hold its breath as if acknowledging the small land bridge's immense influence, a reminder that even the narrowest path can reshape oceans, climates, and the destiny of entire species. From the perspective of the mammoths, it was just a crossing, a simple journey from one patch of land to another, yet the consequences were anything but small. The early winds carried whispers of cold to faraway shores, initiating a slow march of glaciation that would ultimately engulf landscapes, redirect rivers, and redefine habitats. And so, the tiny land bridge, barely noticeable to the wandering herds, quietly set into motion the forces that would usher in a new ice age, a period of enduring chill that would challenge life across continents, leaving a legacy written in rocks, fossils, and the silent testimony of glaciers expanding over a world forever changed. As the Mammuthus americanus continued its careful journey across the emerging land bridge, the landscape around it began to shift in subtle but profound ways. The air felt cooler with each step, a hint of frost starting to cling to the edges of the ground where the sunlight did not reach. Mosses and low shrubs, normally thriving in temperate conditions, appeared to shrink and curl as if sensing the chill in the atmosphere. The distant mountains, capped with lingering snow from previous seasons, cast long shadows that stretched across plains that would one day be covered in ice. Small herds of prehistoric deer moved cautiously, following patterns that suggested instinctive awareness of environmental change, their hooves pressing into the damp soil and leaving tracks that would be fossilized for millions of years. Rivers that had flowed freely began to show signs of altered currents, water swirling differently around sediment deposits, hinting at a redirection that would affect entire watersheds. Birds, unfamiliar and strange to the mammoths, took flight from sparse trees along the edge of the bridge, their calls echoing across the valley and creating a soundtrack of life adapting to subtle climate cues. Mammuthus lifted its massive trunk, sniffing the wind, detecting changes in humidity and the scent of vegetation that had not yet succumbed to the advancing chill. The land bridge itself, narrow and precarious, seemed to hum with a quiet power, its mere presence influencing the flow of currents both above and below the ocean surface. Beneath the surface, plankton and small marine creatures began to shift their migratory patterns, following new temperature gradients as water moved slightly faster in some channels and slowed in others, a reaction invisible to the eye but critical to the ecosystem. As the mammoths moved forward, their movement appeared almost synchronized with the subtle rhythms of the environment, each step influencing and reflecting the larger patterns at work. Insects, tiny and numerous, adapted almost immediately to the cooler, windier conditions, taking shelter under rocks and fallen branches, while amphibians sought moist microclimates to maintain hydration, illustrating the immediate, local consequences of what might seem like a minor geological event. Over the course of several weeks, the gradual accumulation of cold air and altered oceanic flow began to manifest in the form of frost extending farther from mountain shadows, dusting the tips of grasses and the tops of low shrubs. Mammuthus, unaware of the larger climatic shift being triggered, continued to navigate the bridge, grazing on available vegetation, while its herd companions adjusted positions, maintaining social cohesion as they crossed. The sky above, previously a uniform pale gray, started to display streaks of cloud formations indicative of changing weather patterns, heralding the onset of heavier precipitation and colder fronts moving in from higher latitudes. The land bridge, initially unremarkable to the creatures experiencing it firsthand, had become a conduit for a subtle but powerful redistribution of thermal energy across the surrounding seas, gently nudging ocean currents and atmospheric patterns in ways that would set the stage for glacial expansion over thousands of years. Shadows lengthened as the sun moved across the horizon, creating a dramatic interplay of light and cold, highlighting ridges, gullies, and minor depressions that would shape future landscapes, guiding water flow and vegetation growth. Every creature, from the massive Mammuthus to the smallest insect, was participating unknowingly in a grand narrative of ecological change, each step a note in a symphony of planetary transformation. The frost thickened slightly overnight, turning dew into a delicate layer of ice on rocks and low vegetation, signaling that the process of climatic shift was no longer imperceptible. By dawn, the mammoths reached the far side of the bridge, leaving behind tracks that would record not just the movement of individuals, but the footprint of a pivotal moment when geography subtly began to orchestrate global climate change, setting the course for ice and snow to dominate vast expanses in the millennia that followed. In this moment, the connection between land, water, and life was laid bare, a tangible demonstration that even the smallest bridge of Earth could quietly, inexorably guide the fate of the entire planet, illustrating the delicate interplay of forces that operate over deep time and leaving behind a world forever marked by a transformation that began with a single step across a narrow path. By the third week of their journey, the Mammuthus americanus herd had adapted to the rhythm of the land bridge, sensing the changing climate through subtle cues in the air and soil. Frost formed delicate patterns on the exposed rocks, and thin layers of ice began to coat the edges of shallow streams, altering their flow just enough to influence the distribution of nearby vegetation. The mammoths grazed on hardy shrubs and grasses, their massive trunks lifting leaves and branches, unknowingly contributing to seed dispersal across the newly exposed land, planting the blueprint for future ecosystems. Birds with sharp eyes and nimble wings followed the herd, picking off insects disturbed by the mammoth's movement, their calls echoing over the frosted plains and adding a layer of sound to the unfolding landscape. In the distance, clouds gathered in unusual formations, hints of atmospheric shifts that would eventually bring heavier snowfall and reshape precipitation patterns across continents. The currents beneath the ocean surface had started to reorganize, subtly redirecting warm water toward different regions and cooling others, setting in motion a sequence of events that would amplify glacial growth over the next several centuries. Small rodents and herbivores scurried along the edges of the bridge, navigating newly formed ridges and shallow depressions left by the rising and falling tides, their survival strategies intimately tied to the subtle changes wrought by the land bridge. Every element of this environment, from the towering mammoths to the smallest plants, was participating in a grand ballet of ecological interconnection, responding to shifts that humans would not witness for millions of years. The ice from distant glaciers began creeping further down valleys, forming temporary permafrost that changed the soil, chemistry, and influenced which plants could take root, while melting pockets fed into streams that carved new channels through the exposed landscape. Insects adapted their behavior, some entering dormancy to cope with colder temperatures, while amphibians found refuge in the remaining wetlands, balancing hydration against the advancing chill. The sun rose and set, casting elongated shadows over the bridge, highlighting every uneven contour and ridge, creating natural corridors that guided water, plant growth, and animal movement. Mammuthus trunks swept across frost-laden foliage, gently rearranging the plant matter and leaving subtle impressions in the soft earth that would become fossilized evidence for scientists to discover tens of millions of years later. High in the sky, wind patterns began to shift in response to the changing temperature gradients, carrying colder air southward and initiating cycles that would lead to broader glacial expansion. The herd continued forward, driven by instinct, crossing the land bridge as if following an invisible script written by forces far larger than themselves, their passage silently influencing climate patterns in ways imperceptible to any single creature. Streams shimmered with patches of ice, reflecting a world in transition, and the landscape hummed with quiet energy, the interaction of land, water, and life producing small but cumulative changes that were already beginning to ripple through global systems. The mammoth's movement created minor soil disturbances, exposing nutrient-rich layers that encouraged the germination of cold-tolerant plant species, a subtle but lasting mark on the ecosystem. As the herd advanced, air moisture condensed in new ways, forming frost and thin rime that coated low shrubs and the edges of streams, signaling the progression of climatic change. Even the distant mountains seemed to participate, their snow-capped peaks reflecting sunlight differently, altering local temperature and wind patterns, influencing the spread of ice across valleys and plains. The bridge itself, though narrow, had become a channel of energy and movement, a facilitator for both biological and atmospheric changes, demonstrating how a single geological feature could dictate the flow of species and the course of climate over deep time. Every step taken by the mammoths contributed imperceptibly to this process, yet collectively their movement began to harmonize with the planet's larger systems, guiding currents, wind, and ice across vast distances, shaping a future that would be measured not in decades, but in millennia, leaving a world gradually transformed by forces as subtle as the steps of a wandering herd. As the days stretched into weeks, the Mammuthus americanus herd gradually began to move deeper across the land bridge, each step leaving impressions in the frost-tinged soil that told a story of adaptation and survival in an environment quietly transforming. The low shrubs and grasses bent under the mammoth's weight, their movement stirring seeds into the exposed soil, a subtle act that would have lasting effects on plant distribution in the region. Cold winds carried fine particles of sediment from higher elevations, depositing a thin layer across the bridge, and small ponds that had formed in shallow depressions began to freeze intermittently, creating pockets of ice that reflected the pale winter sun. Overhead, migratory birds followed the herd, their flight patterns subtly influenced by wind shifts caused by the rearranged ocean currents, their presence hinting at the interconnectedness of species and climate. Mammoth calves cautiously tested the new terrain, stepping around frozen patches and clinging close to their mothers, their curiosity mirrored by small herbivorous mammals darting among the rocks, adjusting to the cooler conditions. Streams along the bridge carried slivers of ice that twisted and swirled, hinting at the slow but persistent change in water flow driven by both rising and receding glaciers in distant highlands. The soil, damp from overnight frost, revealed traces of microbial life reacting to lower temperatures, subtly influencing decomposition rates and nutrient cycling that would ripple through the food web. The mammoth's movement caused small avalanches of loose dirt and stones on the bridge's gentle slopes, redirecting water flow in tiny rivulets that over time began to shape shallow channels, influencing both plant growth and animal travel paths. As the sun rose higher, the light illuminated ice crystals forming on thin branches and the edges of rock outcrops, highlighting the emerging textures of a landscape in transition, a visible manifestation of climate beginning to take hold. Distant glaciers crept slowly toward lower elevations, their edges sending cold air flowing across valleys, enhancing the frost forming around streams and soil depressions, subtly changing the microclimate where the herd moved. The Mammuthus trunks swept across low foliage, rearranging leaves and seeds while simultaneously providing shelter for small insects and amphibians adjusting to new temperatures, an unseen choreography of interdependent survival. Winds began to carry colder air to regions beyond the immediate bridge, gradually influencing temperature patterns and cloud formations in adjacent lands, hinting at the far-reaching consequences of what seemed to be a small geological feature. The herd's movement maintained social cohesion, with younger mammoths learning to navigate icy patches, shallow depressions, and shifting vegetation, while older individuals tested soil stability, their behavior contributing to the cumulative shaping of their environment. Ice crystals reflected in small pools created patterns that indicated both the changing sunlight and the gradual reorganization of water flow across the bridge, a tangible marker of the broader climatic shifts unfolding. Insects and small reptiles responded to these subtle changes by seeking shelter in the warmed edges of rocks and under plant cover, demonstrating the immediate response of living systems to environmental change. Even distant hills and rock formations appeared altered in hue and shadow as frost thickened in low-lying areas, signaling shifts in albedo and localized cooling effects that would feed into broader glacial growth over centuries. The mammoths, largely unaware of their role in these changes, continued their steady migration, grazing and moving across the land bridge, each action a small but meaningful contribution to the interplay between terrain, climate, and life. Streams meandered around small ridges and depressions created by shifting soil, carrying ice fragments that reflected the pale winter light, a quiet testament to the dynamic interaction of water, ice, and land. Every movement of the herd influenced seed dispersal, soil compaction, and microclimatic conditions, establishing patterns that would persist long after the mammoths had passed, leaving a landscape poised for the expansion of ice and the onset of a broader ice age. The atmosphere, responding to these cumulative effects, carried colder, denser air across the plains, nudging temperatures down and subtly influencing precipitation patterns, laying the foundation for glaciers to expand further, reshaping valleys, streams, and ecosystems over millennia in a silent but unstoppable progression that linked the smallest soil particles to the grand sweep of planetary climate. The Mammuthus americanus herd had reached the midpoint of the land bridge by the 5th week, and the consequences of their crossing were becoming increasingly visible across the surrounding environment. The cold air flowing from distant glaciers intensified, carrying frost deeper into lowland valleys and influencing the microclimates along the bridge. Ice began to form along stream banks and in shallow pools, slowly restricting the availability of open water while simultaneously providing reflective surfaces that changed the distribution of sunlight across the terrain. The mammoths' grazing continued to disturb the soil, exposing new layers of mineral-rich substrate that encouraged the growth of frost-tolerant plant species, subtly altering the botanical composition across the bridge. Insects and small reptiles adjusted their behaviors to the shifting temperatures, finding refuge in sheltered microhabitats, while amphibians took advantage of remaining moist areas to maintain hydration in a landscape slowly succumbing to cold. Above, birds traced the edges of the herd, their flight paths responding to subtle shifts in wind and temperature, a natural barometer indicating changes in weather patterns that were beginning to spread beyond the immediate vicinity of the land bridge. The land bridge itself, narrow and elevated above the surrounding waters, acted as a channel not only for migration, but also for ecological interaction, concentrating the movement of large herbivores and influencing the dispersal of seeds and nutrients. Subtle changes in ocean currents were apparent through temperature shifts at the water surface, hinting at the cascading effects that would eventually reshape coastal climates and influence precipitation patterns thousands of miles away. Snow began to accumulate lightly on higher ridges of the bridge, altering the albedo and reinforcing local cooling trends, while the mammoths adjusted their movement across patches of snow and ice, revealing their resilience and adaptability. The surrounding vegetation displayed the earliest signs of seasonal stress, leaves changing color and texture in response to declining temperatures, with shrubs bending under the weight of frost and forming natural shelters for smaller animals. Streams continued to redirect along microtopographical shifts caused by both ice formation and the cumulative movement of the mammoth herd, shaping new shallow channels that would guide water flow for centuries to come. The Mammuthus calves explored cautiously, lifting trunks to test the firmness of the ground and the availability of edible vegetation, learning the subtle signals of survival in a changing climate while following older herd members who led the way. Ice crystals formed along the edges of ponds and in depressions, casting prismatic reflections of the pale winter sun that shifted with the day, creating a dynamic interplay of light and cold across the bridge. The atmosphere carried moisture from distant oceans, and clouds began forming heavier concentrations, promising snow and rain that would further alter the landscape and provide feedback to the developing ice age. Small mammals used every opportunity to forage under shelter, reacting to the subtle environmental changes in ways that would influence their survival and reproduction in the coming centuries. The mammoths, largely unaware of the magnitude of the forces surrounding them, continued to navigate the bridge, their massive forms shaping the very terrain they crossed and leaving footprints that would become a record of both life and climate. Distant glaciers continued their slow, relentless creep, sending cold winds that mingled with moist air, creating pockets of frost and condensation across plains and valleys, altering humidity and influencing plant growth patterns. Each step of the mammoths not only impacted the immediate soil and vegetation, but also contributed imperceptibly to broader climatic effects, influencing wind flow and air density in ways that would propagate across the landscape. Streams reflected changes in light and temperature, ice forming and melting in small cycles, providing a visual indication of the ongoing adjustments between hydrology and climate. Insects and small reptiles remained attentive, moving to favorable microclimates while plants and mosses adjusted their growth patterns to the evolving conditions. The Mammuthus herd continued steadily across the bridge, a living vector for ecological and climatic change, demonstrating how interconnected land, water, and life are in shaping the trajectory of planetary systems. Every movement, every step, every grazing action contributed to the unfolding transformation, reinforcing the reality that even the smallest geographic features can set into motion profound shifts that echo across time and space, laying the foundation for the ice age that would dominate the region for millennia and leaving an indelible mark on the ecosystems and species that followed. By the 6th week, the Mammuthus americanus herd had traversed most of the land bridge, and the environmental shifts they unknowingly influenced were becoming increasingly apparent across the surrounding regions. The cold air from distant glaciers strengthened, causing frost to form earlier in the day and persist longer into the morning, subtly altering the composition of the soil and influencing which plant species could thrive along the bridge. Ice began to accumulate in shallow depressions and along the edges of streams, altering water flow and creating microhabitats for amphibians and small mammals that sought refuge from the advancing chill. Mammoth calves followed their mothers carefully, learning to navigate icy patches and uneven terrain, while adults tested the firmness of frozen ground with each step, demonstrating behavioral adaptations that would have been essential for survival in colder climates. Overhead, flocks of birds adjusted flight paths in response to changing wind currents, their movement reflecting early signs of altered atmospheric conditions that were beginning to influence regional weather patterns. The land bridge, though narrow, acted as a corridor for ecological interactions, concentrating the movement of large herbivores and facilitating the dispersal of seeds, nutrients, and microorganisms across previously disconnected habitats. Ocean currents beneath the bridge continued to reorganize, subtly redistributing warm and cold water, which in turn affected air temperatures and precipitation in surrounding regions, initiating patterns that would eventually amplify glacial expansion. Snowfall increased slightly at higher elevations, reflecting light differently across the landscape and enhancing local cooling effects, which influenced both vegetation and small animal behavior. The vegetation showed clear responses to these shifts, with leaves and grasses adjusting growth patterns, some curling or hardening to conserve moisture, creating shelter for insects and small reptiles. Streams and rivulets meandered along minor ridges formed by soil compaction from the Mammuthus movement, gradually establishing channels that would influence drainage patterns for centuries. Frost accumulated in shaded areas, providing a visual cue of the slowly advancing ice age, while also affecting the thermal environment of small animals that depended on sun-warmed surfaces for energy. The Mammuthus trunks continued to sweep across low vegetation, exposing seeds and roots that would grow under the cooler conditions, altering the plant community in subtle but lasting ways. Glacial edges in the distance crept incrementally lower, influencing the movement of cold air across the bridge and creating localized weather phenomena that included wind shifts, frost formation, and early snow accumulation. Each step of the herd contributed imperceptibly to these changes, guiding soil displacement, plant distribution, and microclimatic conditions while simultaneously influencing broader climatic systems across adjacent lands. Streams reflected shifting light and temperature patterns, ice forming and melting in short cycles, visually marking the ongoing interaction between water, land, and climate. Insects, amphibians, and small mammals responded rapidly to these environmental cues, seeking shelter or shifting activity patterns to maintain hydration and energy balance. The Mammuthus herd moved with deliberate caution, balancing feeding, exploration, and the instinctive response to new terrain, their presence influencing seed dispersal and soil composition along every mile of the bridge. High-altitude winds carried colder air into adjacent valleys, slowly shaping precipitation patterns and feeding back into the growth of glaciers, which further reinforced localized cooling. The interplay of animal movement, vegetation response, and shifting atmospheric conditions demonstrated how a single geographic feature could orchestrate a cascade of ecological and climatic effects, setting the stage for widespread ice age conditions that would dominate the region for millennia and leaving a lasting imprint on ecosystems, species distribution, and the course of planetary climate. By the 7th week, the Mammuthus americanus herd had reached the far side of the land bridge, and the cumulative effects of their crossing were now resonating across the larger ecosystem. Ice and frost extended farther into the lowlands, altering soil chemistry and creating microclimates that favored cold-tolerant vegetation, while simultaneously challenging species that had thrived under milder conditions. Streams redirected by accumulated ice and shifting soil began to carve new shallow channels, influencing water distribution and the patterns of plant growth along the bridge and adjacent lands. The herd's constant grazing continued to disperse seeds and redistribute nutrients, shaping vegetation communities that were increasingly adapted to frost and snow. Overhead, birds adjusted their migratory paths to take advantage of the altered wind patterns generated by shifting cold and warm air currents, a subtle but telling indicator of broader climatic changes. Small mammals, reptiles, and amphibians adapted their behaviors to the evolving conditions, seeking shelter in soil depressions, beneath rocks, or within frost-protected vegetation, highlighting the interplay between mobility, microclimate, and survival. The glaciers in the distance advanced incrementally, sending cold air downward and reinforcing frost formation along the land bridge, contributing to the establishment of a climate gradient that would continue to propagate for centuries. Mammoth calves learned to negotiate ice patches and snow-laden grasses, mimicking the adult's careful movements and gradually internalizing the instincts required to navigate a world increasingly dominated by cold and variable terrain. Ice reflected sunlight differently across ponds and small streams, modifying local energy balances and influencing evaporation rates, a subtle yet persistent feedback to the developing ice age. The land bridge itself had become more than a mere passage. It was a conduit for ecological and climatic influence, concentrating animal movement, shaping vegetation, and guiding water and nutrient flow across an emergent corridor. Ocean currents continued their gradual reorganization beneath the bridge, redistributing thermal energy across distant seas and subtly affecting precipitation patterns, which fed back into glacial expansion and local frost intensity. Snow accumulation increased at higher points, enhancing albedo effects and contributing to localized cooling, which, when combined with cold air advection, created a complex interplay of microclimates along the bridge. Streams meandered around new ridges and depressions formed by soil displacement from the herd's movement, establishing channels that would influence water flow for millennia and provide unique habitats for small fauna. Frost-tolerant plants began to proliferate in exposed soil patches, their roots stabilizing the ground and contributing to nutrient cycling, while less resilient species retreated to sheltered areas or faced decline. Insects, small reptiles, and amphibians continued to adjust daily behaviors to track the shifting temperature and moisture gradients, demonstrating the responsiveness of even the smallest organisms to large-scale environmental change. The Mammuthus trunks swept across low vegetation, rearranging seeds and foliage, inadvertently creating shelter and food for smaller species, emphasizing the interconnectedness of all life along this narrow corridor. Cold winds intensified the development of frost and snow accumulation, enhancing microclimatic diversity across the landscape and influencing the timing of plant growth and reproduction. The cumulative effect of these interactions was the gradual establishment of colder, more persistent conditions across the region, signaling the onset of a more widespread ice age. Every movement of the herd, every step pressing into frozen or frost-covered soil, contributed to shaping the terrain, distributing nutrients, and influencing microclimates that would persist far beyond their immediate presence. As the mammoths reached the edge of the bridge, their passage had created a lasting imprint on both the biotic and abiotic components of the landscape, demonstrating how the movement of a single herd across a narrow strip of land could catalyze environmental changes with planetary consequences, setting the stage for ice expansion, altered hydrology, and ecological shifts that would define the region for millennia, leaving an enduring legacy in the soils, vegetation, and nascent ice fields that would continue to evolve long after the animals had moved on. As the Mammuthus americanus herd continued their journey beyond the land bridge, the full scope of environmental transformation became increasingly evident. Ice fields expanded gradually from highlands into surrounding valleys, sending cold winds down across the plains, altering the local weather and creating pockets of frost that persisted even through midday sunlight. Streams redirected by newly formed channels carried cold meltwater across the soil, influencing the distribution and growth of frost-tolerant plant species while creating microhabitats for amphibians and small mammals that had adapted to these shifting conditions. Vegetation began to display clear signs of seasonal stress, with leaves hardening and some grasses bending under frost, providing subtle shelter for insects and small animals. The herd moved cautiously over frozen patches, their massive feet leaving deep impressions that subtly compacted soil, redistributed seeds, and exposed nutrient-rich layers that would shape the future plant communities. Birds traced the edges of the herd, taking advantage of the altered wind currents, their flight patterns now subtly guiding insect dispersal and pollination across the emerging landscape. Ocean currents beneath the distant bridge continued to reorganize, redistributing thermal energy and influencing precipitation patterns, which reinforced localized glacial growth and fed back into the larger climate system. Snowfall increased across exposed ridges, enhancing reflective surfaces and reinforcing the cooling trend, while lowlands began to experience intermittent frost that affected both flora and fauna. Streams meandered along depressions created by soil displacement, forming shallow channels that guided water flow, influenced seed distribution, and provided temporary shelter for small animals. Mammoth calves tested the frozen surfaces, learning to balance stability and foraging while observing older herd members navigating complex terrain. Frost crystals reflected sunlight, creating a dynamic interplay of light and shadow that highlighted subtle topographical features while providing visual cues for navigating animals. The land bridge served not only as a passage but as an active conduit of ecological influence, concentrating movement, dispersing seeds, and guiding microclimatic conditions across previously isolated habitats. Small reptiles and insects adjusted their daily routines to track the shifting temperature and moisture gradients, demonstrating the immediate responsiveness of living systems to climatic change. The Mammuthus trunks swept across low vegetation, rearranging foliage and seeds, unintentionally providing shelter and food for smaller species, while influencing soil composition and the microecosystem underfoot. Cold winds funneled along the bridge and surrounding valleys, reinforcing the accumulation of frost and snow, gradually establishing a gradient of cold that would expand with the progression of glaciation. Every step of the herd, each grazing action, and each movement across ice and snow contributed cumulatively to the reshaping of terrain, redistribution of nutrients, and establishment of microclimates that would persist long after the animals had passed. The interplay between animal movement, vegetation response, and atmospheric conditions illustrated the powerful influence a single geographic feature could exert over ecological and climatic systems. As glaciers in distant highlands crept lower, they amplified the cooling of valleys and plains, driving patterns of snow and frost that interacted with animal and plant life in intricate ways. Streams reflected the ongoing shifts, ice forming and melting in subtle cycles that indicated the dynamic balance between land, water, and climate. Insects, amphibians, and small mammals continued to respond to these conditions, adjusting activity, seeking shelter, and exploiting microhabitats shaped by the gradual environmental changes. The herd, largely unaware of the magnitude of its influence, moved with steady purpose, their collective presence guiding ecological interactions and influencing climatic processes that would define the region for millennia. Each movement left a lasting imprint, demonstrating how the passage of a single herd across a narrow land bridge could catalyze environmental shifts with far-reaching consequences, laying the groundwork for expanded ice coverage, altered hydrology, and transformed ecosystems, leaving a world forever marked by the subtle but relentless power of geography and life interacting across deep time. As the Mammuthus americanus herd moved beyond the land bridge into the open plains, the consequences of their journey unfolded across a transformed world, one shaped by subtle forces over deep time. Ice sheets had spread further into valleys and lowlands, redirecting cold air and creating frost-laden corridors that influenced vegetation, animal behavior, and soil composition alike. Streams meandered through newly formed channels, their flow altered by ice accumulation and soil compaction, providing both nourishment and shelter for amphibians and small mammals adapting to the colder, wetter conditions. The Mammuthus continued to graze on hardy shrubs and grasses, their trunks sweeping seeds and fallen leaves into new positions, effectively planting the seeds of future plant communities that could withstand colder climates. Overhead, birds traced shifting air currents, carrying insects and pollen to distant regions, linking the movement of life across the landscape in ways that would echo through generations. The glaciers from distant highlands continued their slow descent, funneling cold air across plains and valleys, reinforcing frost and ice formation in a feedback loop that accelerated environmental change. Mammoth calves learned to navigate patches of ice and snow, observing older herd members as they tested soil stability and located edible vegetation beneath frost-covered surfaces. The reflection of sunlight on ice and snow created shifting patterns of light across the landscape, influencing thermal conditions and subtly guiding the daily activity of small animals, insects, and amphibians. The land bridge, though now behind them, had left a lasting influence on the structure of the terrain, shaping microtopography, stream flow, and seed distribution in a way that connected multiple ecosystems and species interactions. Cold air currents funneled along valleys and plains, creating distinct microclimates that influenced plant growth, animal movement, and water distribution across the broader region. Each mammoth step had compacted soil, redistributed nutrients, and altered the physical and biological properties of the land, demonstrating how a single herd could contribute to the shaping of ecosystems over vast spatial and temporal scales. Vegetation responded dynamically, with frost-tolerant species thriving while more delicate plants retreated to sheltered microhabitats, creating a mosaic of survival strategies across the transformed landscape. Streams reflected the evolving light and temperature gradients, with ice forming and melting in cyclical patterns that marked ongoing interactions between hydrology, climate, and life. The Mammuthus trunks continued to interact with vegetation, exposing seeds, rearranging foliage, and providing temporary shelters for insects and small animals, highlighting the interconnectedness of all life along this corridor. Glacial expansion reinforced temperature gradients, influencing precipitation patterns and the onset of heavier snow in higher elevations, establishing the foundational conditions for long-term ice age climate. Insects, small reptiles, and amphibians continued to adapt, adjusting daily routines to match the subtle shifts in moisture and temperature, while mammals learned to exploit microhabitats for feeding and protection. The herd's movement, largely instinctive, orchestrated a quiet symphony of ecological change, integrating soil, vegetation, water, and microclimate into a system that extended far beyond their immediate presence. Every element, from the largest mammoth to the smallest insect, played a role in this transformation, illustrating how life, geography, and climate are intricately linked. Over millennia, these processes would continue to shape the distribution of species, the formation of glaciers, and the evolution of ecosystems, leaving a world that bore the enduring marks of a single herd's passage across a narrow bridge, a reminder of how even the smallest geographic features can have profound